Good morning. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Janelle Brown, and I'm from Maxar Technologies, Digital Globe and Radiant Solutions, and I will serve as the Mistress of Ceremonies today. I want to take a moment to say a special thank you to my company, Maxar Technologies, as well as Roving Blue for sponsoring last night's reception. I also want to mention Kaki's coffee sponsorship this morning and the water provided by General Dynamics. If you haven't done so yet, please download the Whova app that you can connect with your fellow Symposium attendees. It's also where you can find daily recaps of the Symposium, which is helpful to keep us informed as we bring information back to your home nation or organization. Additionally, the agenda, speaker bios, information on raffles or contests, and even to get in on a carpool to the airport are available on the app. The video you saw just before I came on stage was from the Symposium's gold sponsor, Premise. I'd now like to welcome to the stage a representative from Premise, Jason Wortham. He's the Senior Solutions Consultant with Premise, and he will introduce our keynote speaker. Jason.
Thank you, Janelle, and thank you to the men and women of the Global SOF Foundation. It's an honor and privilege for Premise to have the opportunity to sponsor such a phenomenal event, and it's my pleasure to introduce this morning's keynote speaker. Peter Bergen is a journalist, documentary producer, vice president at New America, CNN national security analyst, professor of practice at Arizona State University, and the author or editor of 7 books, 3 of which were New York Times bestsellers, and 4 of which were named among the best nonfiction books of the year by the Washington Post. Documentaries based on his books have been nominated for 2 Emmys and also won the Emmy for Best Documentary. Bergen also serves as New America's Director of the International Security, Future of War, and Fellows programs. He's a contributing editor at Foreign Policy and writes a weekly column for CNN.com. He is a member of the Aspen Homeland Security Group and a fellow at Fordham University's Center on National Security. Bergen is on the editorial board of studies in conflict and terrorism, a leading scholarly journal in the field. He's held teaching positions at Kennedy School of Government at Harvard and the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. For many years, he was a fellow at NYU's Center on Law and Security. He's testified on Capitol Hill 17 times about national security issues. And perhaps most importantly, Mr. Bergen is chairman of the board of directors for the Global SOF Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Peter Bergen as this morning's keynote speaker.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you to Global SOF. I particularly wanted to thank Stu and Megan and Keenan and Chelsea and Maureen and Stephen for all they do to make this such a success. It's in its 4th year, and every year it keeps getting bigger and more interesting. And thank you for supporting Global SOF and for being here today. So my speech is going to be about terrorism, and it's probably it's worth being reminded that on Monday it's the 25th anniversary of the first attack on the World Trade Center. Now, I'm old enough to remember that day pretty well, where a group of veterans of the Afghan War, supported by some local U.S. citizens, attempted to bring down the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center with a van full of explosives that was parked in the basement. Luckily, that didn't happen. 6 people were killed. But I think it's an important sort of early warning of the long war that we are now in. And if we'd had this discussion, say, 6 years ago during the Arab Spring, shortly after the death of bin Laden, I think I would have come with a more optimistic message, but I'm unfortunately going to deliver, I think, quite a pessimistic message when it comes to the question of how long this war is going to go on. Because 25 years ago, we had an early warning that this war was going to wash up on the shores of the United States. It wasn't sufficiently heated, and of course then came 9/11. Now we're 17 years after 9/11, and the United States is engaged in various forms of military conflict in at least 7 Muslim countries: Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Somalia, and we also have, as you know, special operations forces posted in at least 80 countries, 8,000 special operation forces deployed at any given moment overseas. And the reason I would have been optimistic if we'd had this conversation 6 or 7 years ago is the Arab Spring happened without al-Qaeda's ideas or al-Qaeda's foot soldiers participating in its early days. And with the death of bin Laden, al-Qaeda Central, the group that attacked us on 9/11, was dealt, I think, a decisive blow, since al-Qaeda was so dependent, al-Qaeda Central was so dependent on bin Laden as a leader. But of course, the Arab Spring turned into the Arab Winter, and it has actually given additional space for jihadist terrorist groups to grow and to thrive. And the reason I'm also concerned about the length of this war, which I think will continue throughout my professional lifetime, is shortly after 9/11, a political scientist called David Rappaport at UCLA pointed out that there have been 4 waves of terrorism in the last century. The first wave was the anarchist wave, which began around the turn of the century and burned itself out. But of course, the anarchists managed to kill President McKinley in 1901. Anarchists detonated the first vehicle-borne IED on Wall Street in 1920, killing 38 people with a bomb disguised in a wagon. You can still see where the bomb went off at 23 Wall Street, which was then the JP Morgan Bank. There are still chunks of masonry that have been, you can still see where they were blown up by the bomb today. And the anarchist wave sort of declined because at the end of the day, anarchism didn't really have much to offer. And the second wave was the anti-colonial wave, which eventually burned itself out because it largely succeeded. The British withdrew from Palestine as a result of a campaign of terrorism against them by Jewish groups that pushed the British out. The French group pulled out of Algeria as a result of the insurgency and terrorism that was conducted against them by Algerian groups. The British eventually withdrew from Northern Ireland, partly because of a campaign by the IRA to get them out. And the anti-colonial wave sort of subsided in the late 70s. And then you had the rise of the Marxist wave, the Baader-Meinhof gang, the Brigati Rossi, the Weather Underground. And this too died out because Marxism really didn't have much to offer, and with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the wave just burned itself out completely. And then began the religious wave of terrorism, which we're now in. And really this all began in 1979 with 3 kind of crucial events. The first was the invasion of Afghanistan by the secular communists, which provoked much of what we now know, this global jihadist movement, and people like Osama bin Laden volunteering to fight in Afghanistan against the Soviets. The second big event, of course, was the overthrow of the Shah by religious fanatics, which showed that a religious movement could overthrow a US-backed authoritarian regime in the Middle East, a model that bin Laden and people in bin Laden's circle were very interested in kind of following, even if they were Sunni rather than Shia. And finally, there was the attack on the mosque at Mecca by a group of Sunni militants in 1979, which had got the Saudi monarchy to become much more kind of fundamentalist in flavor, and also speeded up the export of Wahhabism to counter the Iranian Revolution. So those events sparked the religious wave. Now, I think the religious wave is going to go on longer than the other waves because the people involved in this believe that God is on their side. Now, the Soviet Union can go out of business, but you can't abolish God, and this is going to keep this wave going for quite a long time. And obviously we, the United States, and also people like the Counterterrorism Service, General Al-Kanani, and the US-led coalition have had really a tremendous success against ISIS. But I'm concerned that the political conditions that produced ISIS in the first place aren't really going away. Iraq, I think, is, for the first time in many years, there's a lot of potential. I was in Baghdad in December, and it looked very different than the Baghdad I remembered from previous trips. The concrete walls are gone. The sounds of bombs going off or gunfire are non-existent. Abadi is clearly not Maliki, and there's an election coming up May 12th, which, if it goes reasonably well, may help set Iraq on a pretty good course. The Kurds, with their referendum, scored a huge own goal, and that allowed Abadi to actually assert greater control in the Kurdish region. So, for the first time that I've ever felt this, Afghanistan feels like it's going in a much worse direction than Iraq. Usually it's the other way around. So there has been this victory against ISIS, ISIS was a victim of its own strategic failures. We tend to make a mistake, I think, in the way we can conceptualize these things, which is we tend to assume that the enemy is smarter than they are. And of course, you don't want to underestimate your enemy. But I think ISIS had a fundamental strategic problem that made their approach ultimately incoherent and ultimately led to their demise. It wasn't just that they had these terrible ideology and actions, but they had two kind of contradictory aims that ultimately led to their demise. And the first was establishing the caliphate, which they obviously did pretty well in 2014. They controlled territory the size of the United Kingdom. They controlled population the size of Switzerland. But the caliphate goal, which if they had just stuck with that goal, I think they would still be in business. But they extended their aims to also attacking every ethnic group in Iraq, producing a kind of coalition of Kurds, Shia, every Arabs, anti-ISIS Sunni Arabs. They produced this coalition within Iraq against them, and then they also produced a global coalition against them by killing Jim Foley, the American journalist, in a very public manner, by burning alive the Jordanian pilot in a very public manner. They produced a global coalition against them. So the fact that they wanted both a caliphate and at the same time were attacking Americans, attacking other nationalities, this ultimately led to their demise, because it's kind of like Napoleon in 1814. I mean, Napoleon gathered a coalition of every country in Europe that was opposed to him, which led ultimately to his demise in 1815. And ISIS made the same kind of strategic error, which is making a world of enemies. Now, ISIS is gone, but the political conditions that produce ISIS remain. And I think there are 9 really big kind of issues and trends that have caused this. The first is a sectarian civil war in the Middle East, which is powered by very deep pockets, which is, of course, Iran and Saudi Arabia. This sectarian civil war is getting worse, not better. If you look at, we can debate the merits of Mohammed bin Salman. I think he has some good ideas, but he's also made some big mistakes, not least is this invasion of Yemen, which has been a total fiasco. But Yemen is, of course, now one more country in a proxy war between the Gulf states and Iran. And we've already seen this proxy war play out in Syria. We've seen it play out to some degree in Iraq and now in Yemen. And I think that this sectarian civil war in the Middle East is getting worse because the principal funders and the people who could stop it have no interest in stopping it. The second big problem is the collapse of Arab governance. We, the United States, don't learn from our own history. Even if it's very recent history. So in 2003, the Bush administration went into Iraq, knocked over Saddam Hussein, and made pretty much every big mistake you could make, firing the army, firing Baathists, 40,000 Baathists who basically ran the country. And we kind of created a vacuum into which came groups like Al-Qaeda, and a civil war happened. So this was the Bush administration in 2003. Then the Obama administration in 2011 made exactly the same mistake, except in another country, this one being Libya. And we seem to be not able to learn from our mistakes. If you knock over some kind of authoritarian regime, what's going to replace it may be anarchy and civil war, which is what has happened. And so the second big problem in the Middle East is the collapse of Arab governance in the wake of the Arab Spring. And that's true in Yemen and Libya and Syria and in other countries. And there is a kind of political law that we can make, which is the weaker the state is in a Muslim country, the stronger these groups will be, these jihadist groups. Not because these groups are strong, but because the hosts are weak. So in a country like Indonesia, which is a relatively stable Muslim country, yes, these groups exist, but they're relatively trivial. But in a country like Libya, where there's total anarchy and two governments, these groups have proven to be pretty strong. So that's the second big issue. The third big issue is the collapse of Arab economies. At the beginning of the Arab Spring, youth unemployment in the Arab world was 27%. Today, it's 30%, according to The Economist. So the economic trends in the Arab world are getting worse. Then you add to that the population bulge in the Middle East and North Africa, which is the second fastest growing region of the world after sub-Saharan Africa. More and more young men with nothing to do. This causes problem number 4, which is unprecedented wave of immigration from the Muslim world into the Middle East, into Europe. We've had 1 million refugees go into Germany from the Muslim world. And they are encountering a situation where they're not really being accepted. The American Muslims have done pretty well in the United States. On average, they're as well educated as the average American. They have the same average incomes. They don't live in ghettos. The only exception to this are the Somali American population in Minneapolis, in the Cedar Burnside neighborhood of Minneapolis, which is one of the poorest neighborhoods in the country. But that's the exception that proves the rule. In Europe, this is not the case at all. Muslims are discriminated against in Europe and have, to give you one very telling example, 8% of the population of France is Muslim. An estimated 60% of their prison population is Muslim. And the same is true in Belgium, where 6% of the population is Muslim and 30% of the prison population in Belgium is Muslim. So it's not surprising that so many of the people who took part in the attacks in Paris in 2015 and the ISIS attack in Brussels in 2016, it's not surprising that they were all graduates of the French and Belgian prison systems. So we in this country are protected by geography and ideology from the jihadist terrorism scourge that we've seen in Europe. Geography, you can drive from Paris to Damascus. You can't drive from Tampa to Damascus. Ideology, the American dream has worked very well for American Muslims as it has for every generation of immigrants. There is no French dream, there's no German dream, there's no British dream, there's no EU dream. There's no ideological apparatus to bring this massive wave of Muslim immigration that is coming into Europe into these countries. And what you're seeing instead is the rise of European ultra-nationalist parties. These parties used to be really marginal in European politics. Now they're central. So Geert Wilders in Netherlands is the number 2 party in Holland now. Marine Le Pen is an important player in French politics now. Nigel Farage in Britain. The president, the leader of Hungary, Orbán, is essentially a sort of proto-fascist. Poland is led by an ultra-nationalist government. So all these countries where ultra-nationalist parties were marginal, ultra-nationalist parties are now, in some cases, running the country, or even sometimes in a second or third place. And then all these issues are amplified by the spread of militant Salafism around the world and also the rise of social media. Because ISIS was not the problem, it certainly caused problems, it was a symptom of other problems. And the problems were largely centered in the Middle East, but also to some degree centered in Europe. It's not an accident that so many Europeans went to join ISIS. They were doing that because of a reaction to what was going on in their own country. And we've seen 7,000 roughly Europeans join ISIS. We've seen only a handful of Americans attempt to join ISIS or succeed. So I'm concerned in the next iteration that there will be a son of ISIS or a grandson of ISIS. It may not be as successful as ISIS, but it will be something. Because the political conditions I've just outlined, I don't think the Syrian civil war is not going to be magically disappear overnight. Iraq will, even if it does relatively well, will still, there'll still be tensions between certain elements of the Sunni and what they see as the Shia government in Baghdad. And in countries like Afghanistan, if the 2019 election in Afghanistan doesn't go well, I think the whole experiment there may well collapse because the Taliban is in better shape today than it's been since 9/11 in Afghanistan. And so certainly you can point to places around the world where these kinds of groups will get a foothold. What does this all mean for the United States? I mentioned that we're protected by geography and ideology from this. And in fact, the United States has been tremendously successful since 9/11. If I said to you, if we'd had this discussion in 2002 and I predicted in the next decade and a half that on average only 6 Americans a year would be killed by jihadi terrorists in the United States in any given year, that would have seemed like an absurd prediction back in 2002 when we were concerned about another 9/11 attack or some large-scale attack. Now, the fact is that no foreign terrorist organization has successfully attacked the United States since 9/11. The problem we face is a homegrown problem, people who are already here. And why is it that we've not had this attack? Part of it is because of our offensive capabilities, and that's so many of the people in this room have done so much to make sure that groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS or their affiliates are constantly under pressure. So the first big issue is our offensive capabilities. Al-Qaeda Central, the group that attacked us on 9/11, is mostly out of business. And ISIS now is largely out of business. The second area in which we've had a big success is our defensive capabilities. Again, many people in this room have contributed to that. So on 9/11, there were 16 people on the no-fly list. Now there are 81,000. And there are 1.5 million people on the tied list, which is a much bigger list of people who would go into secondary if they got onto an American flight. On 9/11, the FBI and the CIA barely talked to each other. On 9/11, there was no National Counterterrorism Center. On 9/11, there were 30 joint terrorism task forces. Now there are more than 100. On 9/11, there was no DHS. On 9/11, there was no TSA. I mean, I can carry on with just a list of things that we have done to make it much harder for a foreign terrorist organization to attack us. And then you add to that public knowledge. On 9/11, before 9/11, there was very little public knowledge, even though the World Trade Center had been attacked before on February 26, 1993. There was very little public knowledge that this was going to be a major national security problem for the United States. And then, of course, today people are very aware that domestic terrorism is a problem in this country. And where is that terrorism emanating from? Well, overwhelmingly, it's coming from Americans. We can just, some people may be in favor of the travel ban, some people may not, but it's just a factual matter of that the travel ban is sort of a solution in search of a problem that doesn't really exist. Because the people who've carried out terrorist attacks, lethal terrorist attacks in the United States have been American citizens or American legal permanent residents, overwhelmingly, in fact, without exception. They're not foreigners. We're still trapped in the 9/11 idea that foreign terrorists trained out overseas are going to come in and attack us, when in fact it's people who are already here. Major Nidal Hassan, after all, who killed 13 people at Fort Hood, Texas, was born in Arlington, Virginia. He was an Army major and a psychiatrist. It doesn't get as more American than that. Carlos Bledsoe, who killed an American soldier in Arkansas in 2009, he grew up in Memphis. His family had served in the U.S. military since the Civil War. And I can go on giving you other examples. So the problem that we have here in the United States is a homegrown problem. Luckily, it's nothing like the scale of the problem they have in Europe. 1,500 French citizens went to join ISIS. 215 of them, according to the French government relatively recently, have returned. We have had 300 Americans attempt, despite the fact that we're 5 times larger by population than France. We've had 300 Americans attempt to go and join ISIS. Almost all of those people, many of them were arrested at the airport. And maybe a few dozen got through, and perhaps 7 have come back and they've gone to jail. So we just don't have the same radicalization problem that we have in Europe. But we do have some radicalization. And interestingly, the radicalization is entirely online. When we look at the kind of terrorism cases that we're seeing in 2015, almost everybody radicalized online. Again, this goes to the whole question of the travel ban. You can't ban the internet. People are radicalizing in their bedrooms. They're not going to some radical mosque or meeting somebody who's a recruiter for these terrorist organizations. They're radicalizing because of what they see online. And the problem of terrorism in this country is not just with jihadist terrorism. Since 9/11, far right-wing extremists have killed 68 people. We've seen black nationalists kill 8 people in the last couple of years. We saw an anti-Trump terrorist try and kill as many people as possible at a Republican baseball practice in Alexandria, Virginia. Luckily, he didn't succeed, but he severely wounded Representative Scalise, who's the number 3 in the House. And we've had 103 Americans killed by jihadist terrorists since 9/11. So I don't want to just, I want to emphasize that political violence in the United States comes in more than just one type. What do I see some emerging trends that are concerning, and then I'll open it up to questions. One trend that I think is particularly concerning is the terrorists armed with drones. Hezbollah in 2014 took out an al-Qaeda camp in Syria with an armed drone, not something that they were almost certainly given the drone by Iran. We've seen the Houthi rebels in Yemen use armed drones. They've also used submersible drones. Again, I think these are coming from Iran. We've seen ISIS create its own drones. U.S. embassies around the world are well protected against truck bombs, but we need to be thinking about armed drones as the next kind of iteration of what terrorists will use. Secondarily, we've seen a real rise in vehicle attacks in the West. There have been 15 vehicle attacks in the West. Of course, these are very easy to do because it requires absolutely no training. And they can be very deadly. Think about the Nice attack in which 84 people were killed, or just think about the attack in Manhattan relatively recently in which 8 people were killed. We've also seen the increased use of TATP, which is hydrogen peroxide in based bombs in the West. Why is that? If you're trying to make a bomb, TATP is not a very good way to go about it because it's very unstable. But it's very easy to acquire. Hydrogen peroxide is ubiquitous. And so in every attack that we've seen by ISIS or people inspired by ISIS, we have seen TATP bombs. So those are some of the trends I'm concerned about. And just wrapping up here, the trends that I've outlined are extremely, I think, worrisome for the greater Middle East, and I include Afghanistan in that. They are pretty worrying for Europe, and they are somewhat concerning for the United States. But at the end of the day, for all the reasons I've outlined, the United States does not have the problem that Europe has in this regard, and so that's some of the good news. But I do see, unfortunately, that the war that began in many ways with the attack on the World Trade Center on February 26, 1993, is not going to end anytime soon. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Hi, Peter. Do you see any crossing of what we heard from Derek Maltz in terms of state actors interacting in any of these venues with what we had considered more the traditional terrorism, or using social media to influence and create activity with those terrorism? And I won't point to any specific nation because it could be a smaller bit player, but a more institutionalized state type actor trying to influence the terrorism scenario right now?
Well, I mean, I think Iran is certainly, arming groups like the Houthis and Hezbollah, and those groups engage in terrorism as well as insurgency. But I think, if you look at groups like ISIS or Al Qaeda, I mean, they're doing pretty well without any state support, and ultimately, those Sunni militant groups pose more of a threat to the United States than the Houthis or the Hezbollah type groups. I mean, the last time that Hezbollah intentionally targeted an American target was 1983 in Lebanon. Certainly, Iran has, kind of sent EFPs into Iraq to target American servicemen. So, Iran is engaged in some of this state-sponsored terrorist-like activity. But the main thing about groups like ISIS or Al Qaeda is they don't require state support, so that's quite worrisome.
Peter, I was very alarmed to hear that the British had left Northern Ireland. I was there last Friday, and on Friday they were talking about reimposing direct rule because the IRA, who was completely defeated and disbanded, their political wing had failed in government, and on Friday they were talking about reimposing direct rule from Westminster. Obviously, whilst I was here, they've left.
Yeah, no, I misspoke. What I meant to say is the IRA terrorist campaign got the British to give, to pull out their troops and allow greater autonomy to Northern Ireland. And of course, a campaign of terrorism in Southern Ireland also produced even more latitude for the Irish.
Good morning, Peter. As always, you are very well articulated a lot of the challenges that we're going to be facing now and in the future. So, what's the solution?
I mean, there are no simple solutions. If there were, we wouldn't be having this conference probably. Going back to this question of our offensive capabilities, our defensive capabilities, and public knowledge. I mean, we've just done a lot in the offensive capabilities, which is important because you want to try and, you want to close the area in which these groups can work and tighten the pressure on them. Our defensive capabilities are also important because it prevents them doing things in the United States, and public knowledge is important because that gives you 300 million more people who can be concerned about it in a country like the United States. But, there is no really simple solution to all this. I mean, we can't end terrorism. Terrorism's been around since the dawn of time. What we can do is we can manage it. And, it's really a political question about how many resources you want to put into managing it. Do you want to manage it so it's basically 0%? Well, one way to do that would be to turn the United States into a totalitarian state, and know everybody, we'd know what everybody's doing, and we'd have a total police state, and I think terrorism would go down to zero. That would be a very expensive, in many ways, not just financially, but also, to our way of life. So really, it's a question of kind of cost-benefit analysis, which is, what is a tolerable level, an acceptable level of a continuation of some, of this trend. And we're probably pretty much at a place where that we're pretty much in the right place, because one thing that's fascinating me is, despite all the rhetoric between Trump and Obama and the differences, Trump and Obama have really approached this in the same way. Guantanamo is still open, but no prisoners are being sent there. Coercive interrogations have not returned. It's a drone war. It's a special operations war. It's not a conventional, massive conventional war in the Middle East. So there's a lot of continuity between Trump and Obama. That suggests to me that there is quite a lot of kind of consensus, not only in the national security community, but also in the public about how to approach this. Now that we've been in this 17 years, you know, things that didn't really work to our benefit, and for instance, coercive interrogations, you know, we've ended those. The approach that has worked is a kind of light footprint approach. I mean, just think about the war against ISIS. There's no demand signal from the American public to send a 50,000 man or 50,000 man and woman army anywhere in the world to kind of conduct a conventional war. So I think, you know, this is not a perfect answer. I think there are some things we could do. I disagree with Derek about, I think if you're on the no-fly list, if you're too dangerous to get on an American flight, you are definitely too dangerous to buy a semi-automatic weapon legally. This seems to me, you know, just common sense. And the idea that people are on the no-fly list who shouldn't be there is a smokescreen put up by the National Rifle Association. There are 81,000 people on the no-fly list. 800 of them are American. My guess is 795 of them should be there. Maybe 5 of them shouldn't. But don't the rights of us to remain alive outweigh the rights of them to potentially get a semi-automatic weapon? So that, you know, there are some common sense things that aren't going to happen. When you look at Parkland and look at today in the Florida legislature, they wouldn't even take up the idea that there should be a debate about semi-automatic weapons. And by the way, you're 2,000 times more likely to be killed by an American wielding a gun than you are to be killed by a terrorist in this country. So if we going to your question, sir, if we're concerned about people dying and take the ideology out of it, this is an area where clearly, you know, whatever your political kind of views about the Second Amendment, that is too many people dying as a result of, you know, gun murders. You know, Britain, which is a country which has very similar customs and laws, you're 40 times less likely to be murdered by somebody with a gun in Britain than you are in the United States. So a country that's culturally very similar to the United States has very different outcomes. So there are things that we can do to make us safer, but sometimes politically they're very hard to do.
I was wondering about your thoughts on the change in environment, assuming it has changed, the security environment. If we consider what we've done to date, the initial phases, you know, the past, when we countered terrorism, we did so in an environment that was pretty much devoid of great power conflict, or at most it was in the background. Now great power conflict is in the foreground. And I'm wondering your thoughts on the implications of that, both when it comes to the causes of terrorism in the context of great power conflict, and how we counter it with that atmosphere being a consideration again.
Well, that is a brilliant question. And I mean, I don't have a very good answer, but I will say that history surprises us. We were surprised on 9/11. We were surprised by Pearl Harbor. You know, the question is, what do these surprises really make what is important? And if you look at, there have been 3 times in American history where the Republic could have basically disappeared in one shape or another. The first was the Civil War. The second was if the Cold War had turned into a nuclear conflict. And the third, if the Nazis had won in Europe, you know, Western civilization, you know, would have been over. Now, these are existential conflicts. We spent 40% of our GDP during World War II. We put 18 million men and women in uniform because we understood it was existential. The terrorism threat is not existential. Even if they got wildly lucky, as they did on 9/11, we got very unlucky and they got very lucky. They killed 3,000 people. Of course, it was a very tragic day, which was one of the hinge events of American history. But it was not an existential problem for the United States, ultimately. So this great power conflict, which is coming, potentially, because by the law of averages, China is not going to accept, if it is the world's biggest economy, which it's going to be, it will not accept some second place role in the world. And it will collide with us. The only time where a rising power, the United States, and a dominant world power, Britain, where the American and British experience is the only time I can think of where a rising power, the United States, didn't get in conflict with a dominant power, which was Britain. And the reason that probably is the case is we were so close culturally. We're not close culturally with the Chinese. And so, you know, it may well be that when historians write about today, they say, wow, these guys were so blind to what was really happening. They were so concerned about terrorism when they should have been concerned about this great power rivalries that were developing. So the way that the great power rivalry could change the terrorism issue, it could just make it kind of irrelevant in terms of what the actual problems are. Now, I'm not predicting that we're going to go to war against China, but, you know, human nature being what it is, we are going to make mistakes and they're going to make mistakes, and from small mistakes often a war can come. And what form that war takes, is it a proxy war? You know, it's impossible to tell, but I think you're absolutely right to point out that we are in a slightly different place. And obviously in the national security strategy written by H.R. McMaster and his team, and in the DoD strategy, great power rivalries with Russia and China are explicitly called out as the main issue, rather than terrorism.
Sir, just a real quick question. We talk about non-state actors, but I'm seeing kind of a rise of other state actors like WikiLeaks, almost commercialized type actors in this world. Where do you see them fitting in or not fitting in, or what kind of threat they provide?
Another really interesting question. You know, we tend, because we kind of all grew up in the in an era of the Cold War and interstate rivalries, we tend to forget that state monopoly on violence is a relatively recent phenomenon. I mean, think about the East India Company, which basically controlled India. It had its own army. It was a private company. And until 1857, it more or less ran India, which is, after all, not an insignificant place. So I think increasingly we'll see, because of the information technology and others, you will see these non-state actors playing a more important role, or as important role as certain states, because of the information technology has sort of democratized the ability for a number of actors to take bigger roles than they would have been able to do in the past, and whether that's ISIS or WikiLeaks or choose your non-state actor.
Peter, interested in your thoughts on what might not be in a particularly popular thought, but I guess I'm curious what your thoughts are on what if you resourced and budgeted State Department at the same parity as DoD?
Well, Jim Mattis has an answer to that, which is, I need to buy less bullets if the State Department is properly resourced. But his answer is not actually what is happening with the budget, where the State Department has been cut by 30% and the Defense Department has been increased by 10%. At the end of the day, the State Department is not a huge sum of money compared to the Defense Department. If we're going to end conflicts in places like Afghanistan, I mean, we're obviously going to require diplomats as well as soldiers. So, I don't want to wade into too much of the specifics, but I'm not sure that cutting the State Department by 30% is helping American interests. And that's not a comment on the fact that the Defense Department budget is being increased. I mean, I just think that these are not either-or categories, surely. Thank you.